Testing. Good morning, everyone. We'd like to get started. My name is Andy Bain. I'm the Executive Director of the Ukrainian Freedom Fund. I want to thank you all for showing up today. We've had a good evening last night with our registered guests, and it's nice to see so many people come in for the public sessions. I'm honored today to introduce one of our advisory board members, Lieutenant General David Deptula, United States Air Force, retired. I've got to admit, 3 years ago, I didn't know who he was. I'm a Marine infantry officer. We don't pay much attention to the Air Force. But I talked to two Marine generals, General John Allen, 4-star, who'd been commander in Afghanistan, and General John Kelly, who was Southcom commander and then Secretary of Department, one of the departments, and then Trump's chief of staff. And both of their first reaction was, Deptula, he's a serious guy. And for a Marine to hear from two 4-stars that someone's serious, you know you've got a serious person. And he'll tell you about his background. And he's here to talk today about policy implications of the Russia-Ukraine war on the United States. And so I'd like to welcome him and kick off the panels. We'll go panel to panel and just keep churning through the day. If you need to get lunch or water or whatever, just please get up and take care of that. But we'll let General Deptula kick it off. Thank you, sir.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the kind introduction, Andy. And yeah, I guess I could be a serious guy, but I like to have fun too. But we'll save that for tonight. And what I plan to do this morning is talk to you all and offer some thoughts on this particular topic, that being the Russia-Ukraine war and its impact on U.S. policy. And then I promise you I'll save some time, 30-minute session. I'm looking at aiming like 15, 18 minutes for remarks. And then I'd like to hear your questions, because the interesting part is to get into a dialogue and hear what's on your mind. So now when Americans think about the war in Ukraine, we usually think first, and rightly so, about destruction, courage, and human suffering. We think about a sovereign nation fighting for its survival. We think about a people refusing to surrender their freedom. And that's where our attention should be. But it's not where our analysis should end. Because today I want to ask a different question. And that's, how is the Russia-Ukraine war influencing U.S. policy and U.S. military operations beyond Ukraine itself, including in Iran and elsewhere? Now, my argument is pretty straightforward. And it's that Ukraine's war is not just a regional conflict in Europe. It's become a live stress test for the United States. It's changing how serious security leaders in America think about force protection, air and missile defense, logistics, industrial capacity, alliance management, and the relationship between modern technology and enduring military principles. And it's reminding us of something that much of the U.S. military took for granted for decades, and that's control of the air still matters enormously. Now, new tools have changed the battle space, but they have not eliminated the need for operational freedom. This is not just a lesson for Europe. It affects how the United States thinks about the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, force protection in exposed theaters, and any future conflict against a serious adversary. So today, I'm going to cover 5 points. First, Ukraine has changed how the United States thinks about modern war. Second, it's reshaping how the U.S. thinks about force protection in its operations around the world. Third, it's influencing U.S. thinking about air defense, air superiority, and the economics of modern conflict. Fourth, it's changing how Washington thinks about readiness, industrial capacity, and alliance operations. And fifth, it's forcing several broader policy lessons that the United States ignores at her peril. So let me begin with the first, which is how Ukraine has changed how the United States thinks about modern war. For many years, Americans became used to military operations in which the United States enjoyed overwhelming advantages in air power, maneuver, information, precision strike, and logistics. That created a habit of mind. It even led some people to assume that future wars would be quick and dominated by technology alone. But Ukraine shattered that illusion. Oh, by the way, it's not the nature of war. War is laced with uncertainty. Matter of fact, the one thing that the US military has gotten right 100% of the time is that we've never correctly predicted the next conflict that we'll get involved in. Now, Ukraine reminded American policymakers that major war, in Europe no less, is still possible. I mean, think about it. In 2020, and going back since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, I think that folks never really considered the kind of war that's actually occurring today in Europe would break out. Attrition is real. And endurance matters, ammunition matters, replacement rates matter, maintenance matters, training pipelines matter, stockpiles matter, industrial production matters, and the ability to absorb losses and stay in the fight matters. Now, none of that's glamorous, but it's all decisive. And it's one reason Ukraine is already influencing US policy. The war has pushed serious American security leaders to think much harder about munitions production, logistics under pressure, repair and sustainment, and the defense industrial base. Because wars are not won by speeches, they're won by the ability to generate and sustain combat power in all domains over time. That's a lesson from Ukraine. And it's a lesson with global consequences. It means the United States must think differently about readiness. Not just readiness as a slogan, but readiness as a system of production, training, logistics, repair, stockpiles, and resilience. And I hesitate to go off script. And my wife always tells me, don't tell stories because you'll go on forever. But just that statement reminds me that on any given day, and many of you might not know this, and being a guy that kind of specializes in air and space power, I happen to know it. On any given day, there's 700 aircraft in the United States Air Force inventory that are grounded because of lack of spare parts. Part of that is attributable to the fact that the Air Force is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready it's ever been in history. But it gets to the point of buying spares, of doing the kinds of things that we moved away from over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, because we thought peace, love, and happiness was going to break out around the world. If a country cannot sustain combat power, then eventually it cannot sustain strategy. So that's the first lesson. Second, Ukraine is reshaping how the United States thinks about force protection and military operations around the world. Ukraine has shown that the modern battle space is far more transparent and far more lethal than many expected. Units are easier to detect, headquarters are easier to target, movements are easier to track, communications are easier to disrupt, rear areas are less safe, and low-cost aerial threats can appear in large numbers. That matters for US military operations far beyond Europe. It matters in the Middle East. We're kind of learning some of those lessons real time over the last 6 weeks. It matters in the Indo-Pacific. It matters for US bases, outposts, logistics hubs, and ships anywhere on the earth. One of the most important lessons the United States has had to relearn is that force protection can no longer be treated as a secondary matter. If a relatively inexpensive aerial threat can bypass weak or non-existent defenses and hit a U.S. installation, then the problem's not merely tactical, it can actually become and have a strategic impact. Ukraine has made clear that cruise missiles, quadcopters with hand grenades, one-way attack drones, whatever you want to call them, and other low-cost precision threats can impose serious pressure on military forces and civilian infrastructure alike. And the effect is not limited to the front lines. It extends to command networks, to supply systems, to airfields, shipyards, troop concentrations, to power systems, and yes, to political decision-making. That's why this war matters for U.S. operations well beyond Ukraine. Adversaries today can threaten bases, saturate defenses, pressure partners, and raise the cost of U.S. operations through mass missile attack and low-cost air attack. That means Ukraine's war is influencing U.S. military thinking in a very practical way. America must be better prepared to defend people, bases, infrastructure, and operations against persistent aerial attack. That's not theory, that's not speculation, that's operational reality. You're going to have the opportunity to hear later on in the day, probably, I'll put in a plug for it, the most interesting presentation, and that's what it's like to live in a country under daily attack from people who live that. So those remarks I just made didn't just apply to the military. I don't know how many of you ever read the Chinese book written, it's called, having a senior moment here. I'll think about it in a minute and I'll get back to you. But the essence of the book is the way the Chinese plan to take care of the United States is not through mano-a-mano combat. It's through accomplishing the unexpected. You know, when there's nothing more leveraged than electricity. When your electric grids go down, think about how you would operate for more than 24 hours without electricity. All those little devices some of you are looking at, that when you're done charging them, that's it. You're out of Schlitz. Okay, you might have a solar powered, power bank, but that's going to run out of juice too. So it's a real lesson. The lesson's not that only that adversaries can strike. The lesson is they can strike cheaply, repeatedly, and at scale. And if we're not prepared for that, we invite risk, escalation, and strategic surprise. That's the second lesson. Unrestricted warfare. That's what happens when you get old. It takes a while for the neurons to connect. But Google it. Unrestricted warfare. It's written by 2 Chinese Air Force colonels back in 1999, and it gives you the blueprint for how the Chinese plan to operate. You can get it online for free. It's worth a read. Third, Ukraine is influencing U.S. thinking about air superiority, air defense, and the economics of modern conflict. Let me put this plainly. One of the wrong lessons some people are taking from the Russia-Ukraine war is that air denial is an acceptable substitute for air superiority. Now, I know, I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole for the general population to understand, but there's a big difference between air superiority and air denial. And there's some folks out there that say, well, air superiority is too hard to get, which essentially means the ability to control the air to operate in a particular time and location of your choosing. Not forever, but just for a particular period of time. Air denial is, well, you just prevent the enemy from operating over you. Two different things. But these people see a battlefield filled with unmanned systems, electronic warfare, dense air defenses, and they conclude that modern warfare is too difficult to think in terms of controlling the air. And I'd tell you that's a mistake. Ukraine-Russia war teaches something very different. It teaches what happens when neither side can gain enough control of the air to operate freely and at will. The result is a grinding, attritional war in which movement is difficult, logistics are vulnerable, and decisive breakthroughs are rare. Now, this should matter enormously to the United States. Like I said, air superiority doesn't mean perfect control everywhere. It means enough control of the air at a given time and place to operate without prohibitive interference from enemy air and missile threats. In plain English, it gives us two invaluable advantages: the freedom to attack and the freedom from attack. And the Ukraine-Russia war shows what happens when that is absent. So if the United States wants freedom of action, it cannot be satisfied with merely enduring contested airspace indefinitely. It must be able to suppress threats, protect forces, and open operational space for joint force operations. That requires capability, capacity, solid doctrine, integration, and serious attention. Now, at the same time, Ukraine has underscored a major cost problem. An attacker can often launch large numbers of relatively inexpensive aerial threats, while the defender may be tempered to answer with very expensive interceptors. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not sustainable. So one of the most important ways Ukraine is shaping U.S. operations is by highlighting the need for affordable defensive depth. The United States needs better counters to cruise missiles into swarms, better electronic warfare, sensors, integration among the services, and better ways to attack launch sites, storage areas, and production nodes of the adversary before these threats are ever launched. The notion here is to kill the archer, not wait till he or she shoots the arrows and hit them one at a time. The answer is to make air superiority sustainable in a much more demanding environment. That's the lesson for Europe, Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and any theater where the United States may face mass air and missile threats. Because the side that can operate freely enjoys a profound advantage, and the side that cannot is condemned to pay more, suffer more, and move more slowly. So that's a lesson worth underlining. Fourth, Ukraine is changing U.S. thinking about readiness, industrial capacity, and alliances. The war has reminded the United States that readiness is not just about owning advanced platforms. It's about sustaining them. It's about replacing losses, modernizing systems. How many of you know that the youngest B-52, the largest number of bombers in not just the US, but in the free world's entire bomber force, the youngest B-52 is 63 years old. April 15th was the anniversary of the 73rd anniversary of its first flight. I'm sorry, 74th. Scaling production, training people. In that sense, the defense industrial base is not separate from U.S. military power. It is U.S. military power. And Ukraine has forced the United States to think much more seriously about just what prolonged conflict would demand from factories, logistics networks, stockpiles, and procurement systems. And it's reinforced the importance of alliances, not as abstract diplomatic assets, but as operational multipliers. That lesson matters in Europe, obviously, but it also matters in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm gonna digress and tell a short war story here. If you go back to Desert Storm, we had 43 coalition members in that alliance. But I'm here to tell you, in 1991, in all candor and honesty, we didn't need them. I mean, we wanted them, they contributed, it was wonderful stuff. But we could have done all of that just by the force structure that we had alone. Today, we're 40% the size, the US military is 40% the size than it was during Desert Storm in 1991. Today, we need allies and partners just be able to have sufficient capacity to deal with an adversary like a Russia or a China. And now also the United States can't assume it's going to face future crises one at a time. Ukraine has made that point forcefully as we got involved in the Middle East. Washington has to think in terms of concurrent stress, supporting allies in one region while deterring or responding in another. That's why the Russia-Ukraine war is influencing U.S. global operations. It's forcing American planners to think about how resources, attrition, munitions, air defense capacity, and logistics are distributed across theaters. Put simply, Ukraine has made U.S. policy more conscious of the fact that global military power is a system. It's not just a collection of isolated missions. What happens in one theater affects options in another. What's consumed in one crisis affects readiness in the next. What's learned in one conflict shapes success in another. That's especially important when thinking about U.S. security strategy, because American operations in one location cannot be planned in isolation from Europe, Middle East, Asia, Western Hemisphere, or Homeland Defense. And that's why this war has become far more than a regional issue. It's now a test of whether the United States can think globally, act coherently, and adapt quickly enough for a world of simultaneous pressure. Fifth, to broader policy lessons, and I'm going to chat with you in this last portion are even sharper. Ukraine has displayed extraordinary ingenuity. It's adopted with speed, creativity, and courage. It's made remarkable use of small, uninhabited systems, battlefield precision attack, mobile defenses, camouflage, deception, and improvisation under pressure. Yes, the United States should study all of that. It should also study survivability in transparent battle space, decentralized adaptation, the integration of low-cost precision systems, electronic warfare, and the changing relationship between sensors, shooters, and targets. But it should also learn three larger strategic lessons. And these are not minor points, these are major policy issues. First, do not provide your adversary sanctuary. What's amazing is this should not be a new lesson. We should have learned it in Korea, we should have learned it in Vietnam, and yet in this war, two administrations were deterred by Putin's rhetoric from providing Ukraine the weapons early enough and in sufficient quantity that would have allowed Ukraine to strike Russia's critical centers of gravity deep inside of Russia. That was a mistake. Now, Ukraine has eventually developed its own long-range precision attack systems to do what outside support would not enable. But that took time, and time in war is never neutral. Because if you leave the enemy's heart untouched, do not be surprised when the war becomes longer, harder, and more expensive. That is not prudence. That's self-deterrence, and self-deterrence is a terrible strategy. And that's a line worth remembering. Second, do not give the adversary the gift of time. Russia began this war with poor leadership, poor training, poor execution, and serious military weakness. But time is a weapon. Time lets an adversary recover, entrench, mobilize, build defenses, and expand production. Bottom line is time lets them adapt. By not supplying weapons early and not supplying them in the mass quantities when they could have mattered the most, the West gave Russia the gift of time to stabilize the battlefield, dig in, build strong defenses, strengthen its war machine, and adapt to the circumstances it faced. That was not a minor delay, it was a gross strategic error. And in war, the gifts you give your enemy are usually paid for by your friends. It's a sad line, but that's another line worth remembering. Third, do not deny yourself firsthand learning. Here's another one where we shot ourselves in the foot. One policy mistake in this war was not putting U.S. military personnel in place as observers. Not combat forces, observers. People close enough to gather real operational insight in real time. Wars are unforgiving teachers, but guess what? They're also unmatched laboratories for military learning. By failing to position U.S. military observers to study this war directly, we accepted slower learning, filtered reporting, secondhand information, and delayed adaptation. In a war of this significance, that was a missed opportunity. If you want to prepare for future conflict, you do not study war only through briefings after the fact. You study it as it unfolds. That's how serious militaries learn, and that's how serious militaries adapt. So the larger policy lesson is this: learn from Ukraine's innovation, resilience, and warnings. But do not accept prolonged attrition as a template for future war. Do not confuse denial with control. Do not provide sanctuary. Don't give the adversary the gift of time. And do not deprive yourself of firsthand battlefield observations. Because frustrating an enemy is not the same as shaping the conflict on your own terms. And surviving is not the same as winning. That's the core point. So let me close with this. Ukraine's war is influencing U.S. policy in many ways through logistics, procurement, force protection. I mentioned alliance management, air defense, and industrial planning. But beneath all of those is a larger truth. Ukraine has reminded the United States what war looks like when the skies are contested, the rear is vulnerable, cheap mass is dangerous, and operational freedom cannot be assumed. That matters anywhere the United States may have to operate under pressure. So the right takeaway is not panic. It's not nostalgia either. It's seriousness. We need to get serious about readiness, force protection, capacity, air and missile defense, industrial production, about striking the adversary's critical centers of gravity. Seriousness is about denying the enemy time to recover and adapt, about preserving the ability of the U.S. to create freedom of action for its forces through air superiority. Because in war, the side that can operate freely has an enormous advantage. And Ukraine has reminded us, at terrible cost, what happens when no one can. So let me wrap it up there, and thanks very much for your attention. I didn't see anybody falling asleep, so let me see, we've got, oh, I didn't leave as much time as I wanted to, but we have time for a couple questions. Anybody? Yes, sir.
You mentioned quite frequently about the low-cost threats,
Yeah.
drones and so forth. I'd like to get reassured that AI defense industrial capacity is actually thinking about this. And there's two parts to this. A, shooting down $1,000 drones with $1 million missiles, as you said, not a really good idea. If somebody is working on a cheap way to destroy cheap weapons, and whether or not those weapons will be technologically so advanced that common soldiers can use. And what would that do to our force structure? We need super specialists to do all this.
Okay, first, that's a great question. Did all of you hear that? Did you hear that back? Okay, so real quickly, it's, I spoke a lot about low-cost weapons, and the essence of the question is U.S. defense industry engaged in building counters, and then are these weapons so sophisticated that we have to introduce new training techniques, and procedures for, your average grunt to be able to operate them? Is that fair reproduction of your question? I mean, the short answer is yes. The short answer is yes, we are. I'm a little frustrated we didn't take these lessons on 4 years ago, but it's kind of our bureaucratic nature. It takes us a long time. And where we can learn a lot in this regard, which I hope I pointed to, is from the Ukraine. I mean, they have done the innovation, and they've come up with defenses. And by the way, everyone gets all excited and quite frankly, I think over-enthusiastic about these things which we call drones. It's not the drones themselves. You know what's the real lesson that we need to learn from what the Ukrainians have done? It's the rapidness in which they can accommodate to counters by the Russians. That's the real lesson. But the short answer to your question is yeah, we got it. It's just taking a while. Yes, sir. About the what?
Contingency.
Yeah.
You know, Democratic people are always contingent. They want things to be over.
Right.
You know, we hear talk of forever wars already, that kind of thing. How do you deal with that, especially in the age of social media and technology? So many of our enemies or adversaries
Yeah.
Now it seems like 7 days,
Yeah.
7 weeks. So I wonder if you could relate your remarks about contingency to that larger phenomenon.
Yeah, okay, again, for the audience, the questions, perspectives with respect to operational contingencies and the impact of the short attention span of the American public and tolerance. Is that a fair? Yeah, well, you strike a very important point, and that's the management of perceptions, number one, which our adversaries do very well, which we don't do at all, okay? There's 4 pillars of U.S. national security, right? Diplomacy, information, military, and economic. Guess what? We have cabinet level agencies for 3 of those 4. Which ones do we not have? Not only do we not have a cabinet level agency, we don't put any organizational perspective behind it. Information. Yet, again, that little device all of us have carry around with, you get manipulated by the adversary. Your perceptions are affected every single day. So it is a huge factor. How do we deal with it? By setting out first, before we get involved in a contingency, I'm going to go back and use Gulf War, because it's kind of an optimal model. You know, you bring together a coalition, you provide very clear-cut rationale with a very clear insight, and you go and you get concurrence, in the case of Desert Storm, with the Congress, and many of you may have forgotten, but that was a very close vote. And then you go and you do your business, you get done, and you get out. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are always going to be 43-day conflicts. They are going to go on. But part of that is preparation and explaining and trying to educate the public about the fact that every contingency is going to be different. And so you have to accommodate to the particular contingencies of the time. Look, it's a wonderful question. I could go on forever, but you know, I hope that helps. Are we up against do you have time for a couple more questions? I love questions. One more? Oh, they're telling me one more. Okay. Yes, sir.
Kind of follow on. Is the United States working closely with Ukraine to develop our own drone technology and tactics, or are we reinventing it?
Okay, the question is the United States working closely with Ukraine to develop counter-drone tactics? Again, the short answer is yes. You know, there is a group I talked about, you know, look, we don't have, you know, at any given time you might have 10 or 12 uniformed personnel visiting Kyiv, but you don't have people embedded as observers throughout Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that we're not learning from there. European Command has an entire cell that works very closely with the Ukrainian military. And so those kinds of lessons are being extracted. I just wish that they were at a greater magnitude than they are. The second part of that is, hey, what's one of our strengths? You know, it is industry. And private industry certainly knows what's going on. And there's all kinds of levels of innovative partnerships that are growing and developing. Matter of fact, I know of one that I was just briefed on here recently about how to better incorporate supply management to more cohesively not just provide Ukrainian forces with parts to optimize their building of these small, very cheap, disposable tools of war, but that would apply very well to the United States military as well. So yeah, there's a lot of that going on. So, well, look, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to hang around over here on the side if you want to grab me. Thanks very much for your attention. You've been a wonderful audience, and have a great day. Thank you.